But usually in companies, there's a notion of a hierarchy, a set of objectives, a quarterly plan, and so forth. We had none of that. Our theory was that the leadership, in particular the bottoms-up leadership, really should be empowered by what we were doing, and we'd see how far they get. We didn't have an 18-month strategy. We just kept iterating. So what I learned from this is that fast iteration is the key. The most important thing to do is every week, a new product, a new idea, just keep pushing. You'd be amazed how much progress you make in 3 months or 6 months.
Technology mind and the background that you had, you know, working at Novell, working at Bell Labs, working at Xerox, you know, to that point in your career when you met Larry and Sergey, I wonder what led you to choose that opportunity next? What about them was so different that that made you say, okay, this is the next thing for me to do?
In my case, I'd been working at Novell, and I was invited to visit Larry and Sergey, they invited me to their little office. They had all this food on the table, which had been prepared by the Google chef, which I thought was rather odd. And they had my background on the whiteboard, which they were projecting, and they proceeded to examine me in terms of my ideas and the technology we were building, which they disagreed with completely. And I thought, well, that's a very nice meeting. And I realized as I left, and it was curiously in an old Sun building, that it was the most interesting conversation I'd had in a decade. And that's why I joined.
Could it have gone another way? Was there a moment that you looked at that, if you look back on that and said, if this has happened, I wouldn't have taken it, or if this had happened, I wouldn't have gotten it? Are there moments like that?
I think from my perspective, because I'd already run a large organization,
exactly.
I wanted to work in a very small, very, very smart organization, and I figured Google would be that. You know, God knows it came out differently. But what I learned in this process is that if you can, there's always people smarter than you. There's always people who just think more clearly than you. And if you can find such a person, align yourself with them. In this case, these two young men are, they're in their 20s, right? And they're awfully precocious. And I haven't had that tough an argument from young men in a long time. And I thought, this is it. You just knew. And these people are rare, and we now know them as the great founders in our industry, and I'm sure some of them are here in the audience. If you find such a person, work with them, work for them, manage them, do whatever it takes. Don't want to hear from...
Yeah, from someone who's pitching you, what don't you want to hear? Everyone asks what you do. What don't you want to hear?
I want to hear that everybody is focused on this new architecture, and anybody who's coming in with plans based on the earlier architectures, you're not going to make it. You need to be on scalable plans that solve real problems. It's so easy to solve a local problem. You need to dream bigger. Over and over again, we hear ideas that are interesting in a local context, but they're not big enough. So dream bigger, right? As a general statement about society, we need to ask the harder questions, and we need to ask for stronger solutions. There is a global emerging consensus around issues and so forth. Together, we're very strong. People you hire define the culture, whether you like it or not. So Larry and Sergey, when they started the company, said, we need to have really smart people, so they hired a rocket scientist, and they hired a medical doctor, and they hired a Stanford graduate who had been a professional football player, because they figured that they wanted normal people who had done something exceptional. So in my case, I was a pilot, and I had done other things, and they said, okay, you're good enough. The CEO has to have something besides being a CEO that makes them interesting. And everyone had something. And I would go around and I'd say, well, what's special about you? It's like Sesame Street. What's special about you? And what's special about you? But there was always an interesting story. So another lesson I learned is that you don't hire generic people. You hire people who've had some kind of stress or achievement or whatever. The best people to hire, by the way, are CFOs who've gone bankrupt. Because boy, have they been through the war. And on the CFO side and the finance side, you want somebody who's not going to happen again. Yeah. And you only go bankrupt once, by the way.
Equity. What would you tell a founder they should do to protect and to hold on to their equity? What advice would you give them?
Well, I can always tell when we're dealing with a proper founder when we start with how are they spending their money. And so whenever I go into a startup that has beautiful offices and really nice chairs, I cringe. Because that means that they haven't quite figured out that it's not their money. Unless it is their money, in which case they can waste it on that. When I joined Google, I was given an office, and I had a little corner of a desk with 4 other engineers. Eventually, I was given an 8x12 office where my desk was a door with hobby horses, whatever they are.
Like the tabletop was a door?
Tabletop, literally a door, which I've retained to try to remind myself of what it takes to be successful. So my office today has that door in it. The great founders are frugal. They understand that the money needs to be used precisely for certain areas. Many of the most successful founders begin with no salary at all. I have lots of stories about Larry and Sergey, but let's just say that when I started, one of them was having trouble with his car, so I had to loan him his car because his car broke down, or my car because it broke down. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. And so if you're not prepared to live that, you don't really understand what being a founder is like. I mean, for me, I'd love to be a founder. I'd love to have a nice corner office with a beautiful view and lots of secretaries. And all this. That's not how it works, right? And the great founders always started that way, so that should give you some